Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ramiro Albrieu. I'm the coordinator of the Future of Work in the Global South initiative, an initiative funded by IDRC from Canada, and that I've been managing for the last years, we can say, first in CIDE, Mexico, and then in CIPPEC, Argentina. We are here to present our book on the name is Cracking the Future of Work, Automation and Labor Platforms in the Global South. But behind this title are very insightful research pieces on the future of work from the Global South perspective, right? So when we started this project several years ago, we realized that the global discussion on the future of work was somewhat biased towards the global north challenges, opportunities, and facts, for example, regarding technological change. And that there were a big mismatch between these discussions and the real challenges of the future of work globally, taking into account that the majority of the working age population is living in the developing world. So first we realized this mismatch, and we also detected a lot of papers and data and research about the Global South and the future of work in a kind of information overload situation in many topics, such as automation or the platform economy. But also we realized that there were huge knowledge gaps, So in a way we have this combination of information overload in some topics and knowledge gaps in some other topics or in some regions or countries, right? So the idea of the project, or our main goal, was trying to address these three issues, with new research, with new data, compiling also or already existing research, and so on. That's how we came up with this book, where 25 plus researchers gathered together, trying to bring new perspectives on this topic, on the future of work. We, of course, the future of work has many dimensions, and even technological change, or the fourth industrial revolution as a name, has many different technologies, different interactions with labor market conditions, and so on. So we decided to focus on two main technological trends. One that has to do with automation in the workplace, and the second one that has to do with the penetration of the platform economy, like digitally mediated labor relationships. So the book is about these two main technological developments, we can say, and their relationship with labor markets. And also these two topics are addressed in different ways, with different methodologies, with different questions, with the idea that it's not that simple to grasp what's going on with technology and labor markets nowadays, and also with the idea that we need to come up with different perspectives, different angles, different data to understand, to get a better understanding of the future of work challenges. So the first, well, you can download the book from our website, that is FoWiGS.net, FoWiGS, Future of Work in the Global South.net, and then we will disseminate the book through our media and so on. But you can check all the book with all the data and discussions there. But now we want to show you just like a first-hand view from the authors of the chapters that are here with us. So I will start with Irene, Irene is one of the authors of a very interesting paper that analyzes technologies, emerging technologies and the future of work in Latin America, and that they use a battery of measures for technological penetration, not only robot penetration or routinization or not routinization of jobs. So Irene, along with Andrés César, Guillermo Falcone, and Leo Gasparini, wrote the first chapter of our book. So Irene, thanks for joining. And I have a first question for you regarding your research questions. I mean, tell me more about your research question and how you address these questions. Irene?
Well, thank you, Ramiro, and hello, everyone. Let me first say that this has been a very exciting project to be part of. All of the projects are so very different, but they complement each other very well. And I'm very, very happy with the book. I don't mean just my chapter, I mean the whole book. I think it has been really nice how we have approached this from different angles, and it's a multidisciplinary thing that ends up being very complete. I really like it. What we do is, this has been, we have done a lot of work. We have produced several papers, and we have summarized all that in a book chapter. Our objective is more or less similar to everyone else's. We want to know what's the effect of automation on employment, basically. And what we are particularly focused on is how this affects different demographic groups. So the effects of automation are not homogeneous. Some people are more likely to be harmed. Some other people might benefit from automation. So we want to dissect by demographic characteristics, and we follow what is called the task-based approach. This approach basically says that people are affected by automation differently depending on which tasks they perform in their job. The more routinary task, the more repetitive, the more easy it is to be codified, and it can be put into a computer or a robot, and it can be performed automatically. So, for example, if you take when you go to the airport and you need to do the check-in, before it used to be at the desk with the person. Now you can go to a check-in machine. Why can you do that? Because there's a very precise set of rules. You need to somehow enter your reservation number. You need to provide some form of ID that the machine can check. You need to answer how many bags you want to check in, and then the machine issues a boarding pass. That's a very precise procedure. There is no room for creativity or interpersonal skills or nothing that needs to be solved on the fly. It's just everything predetermined, and it works fine. So those are the jobs that are at risk of automation. It doesn't need to be a computer. It can be a computerized robot if it's a manufacturing job. The same thing happens with online sales and many things that need to follow a very precise procedure. So it can be just performed by a machine. So what type of workers perform these routinary jobs? Well, this correlates a lot with being unskilled. So unskilled workers tend to be more easily replaced. It also correlates with being young, because young people, again, tend to perform routinary jobs. It also correlates with being a woman. So those are the demographics that are more at risk, of course, on average, right? Why is this? Well, because we know what are the routinary jobs. Now let's think which are the flexible jobs. Flexible jobs are those that require some sort of decision-making, that cannot be a contingent rule, very precise rule. It needs creativity. It needs to think out of the box, not a decision-making progress that a computer can follow. When there's creativity, when there's leadership, when there's solving problems. So these are the types of tasks that are performed with people with skills. with experience. So they correlate with this type of characteristics. What we do more precisely in our research, so that was like the conceptual approach. What we do is we put together a lot of data, but really a lot of data. We use two different types of surveys. We use a bunch of surveys conducted by the OECD. They are called the PIAC surveys, and they relate to skills and tasks. So we use these surveys that are run in several countries to study or come up with an index number that quantifies how repetitive a particular occupation is. So, for example, a teacher is not a repetitive occupation. The extreme would be the airline check-in that I was telling you about a moment ago. That is something that is repetitive. So we use the OECD surveys to characterize each occupation, and then we use household surveys from Latin America. We take the six largest countries in Latin America: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. We pull together household surveys from all these countries, and we map with the skill surveys. We have constructed indices at the occupation level, and now we can impute these indexes into the household surveys. And so to each worker in Latin America that is replying this survey, we can assign an index of possible routinization. So we can correlate this with all these demographics that I was telling you about. This has been a very, very data-intensive task. I mean, these household surveys, they are like approximately 3 million observations. We have many, roughly 2 decades of data and 6 countries. So it's we have made all that compatible across time, across countries, the different definitions of occupations, of income. It has been a very intensive job in what data is concerned. And so then we use all this information to study what is going on with unemployment, employment, wages, informality, and so on.
Yeah, I like about on your chapter and on your research agenda as more general, that you try to exploit data from the global South. You know, because in these discussions, we started with the ONET and basically data on the US, you know, labor market characteristics. So in a way, this strategy of go to see what's in the global South through maybe PIAC, to different surveys, I think that's an innovation, you know, in a way of trying to get a better understanding of the future of work in our region. And also this, because you mentioned a lot about skills and so on, this idea of maybe instead of talking about technological unemployment, we need to start talking about these skills mismatches, right? So, and what about the findings and the implications? You told me something about the findings, about who are the losers, we can say.
Yes.
In this, but what about policy?
So the findings, some of them are bad news, but there are also some good news. So we do find that, well, first of all, there's heterogeneity across countries in Latin America, and that's because the occupational composition is different within countries in Latin America. Even within countries, there are differences at the district level because the occupational structure is different. So we find that in districts in which employment is more biased towards routinary occupations, there has been an increase in unemployment. There has also been an increase in informality. But there are also some good news, which are the jobs are changing. I mean, people are not merely switching from jobs to being displaced to unemployment. There's also a sort of migration towards more flexible jobs. And looking at many years of data like we have, there's a very, very clear trend of an increase in the share of flexible occupations. So workers are switching to more flexible jobs, and that's very good news. A concurrent phenomenon going on in Latin America is that across cohorts, there has been an increase in skills. So that is also an explanation of why people are switching to more flexible jobs. They are more qualified to perform flexible tasks. So all these are good news. Also, young people are affected because they don't have as much experience, so they tend to receive instructions and perform repetitive tasks, but that changes along the career path. It's not something that young people will do forever. So their career path looks promising in that sense, because they are a generation with more skills and more prepared to work in a complementary way with technology. So the career path is promising. What is really important, and especially in this time of pandemic, that education has suffered such a huge blow, is that this highlights the importance of continuing to invest in education, and so that that increase in skills that we measure as formal education, it needs to continue being meaningful, not being just a title. It needs to be an education that gets modernized and able to work in complement with technology. The policy implication is very loud and clear. It's not restrict technology, it's improve education and continue to invest in education forever. Yeah. So that is the very clear message from all this.
Okay, thanks Irene for this summary of your research and of your chapter. I also got two messages besides yours. One is about this idea again of an heterogeneous impact, of technology, and the idea that maybe we will have, as I mentioned, winners and losers around this technological change. And the second is that you mentioned that maybe low skill workers are going to suffer, and maybe in the global north, the discussion is more about the hollowing out, this middle skill working age or workers that are struggling, but maybe in our countries it's kind of different. So I will move with these questions or ideas to Roelof Berger. Hi, Roelof, along with Janet Pieters, Anna Kushunsis, and Joel Gungui, wrote the second chapter on automation. The chapter is called Inequality at Risk of Automation. Your chapter focused on gender differences in automation, and I know that you also use different data than Irene. So again, same questions. Your research question, your methodology, and then if you want just to go for the findings and the policy implications. Roelof?
Great, thanks, Ramiro. So I'm very excited about the launch of this book, which I think makes a very useful contribution to what we know about the effects of technology on the labor markets in the global south. So the chapter that you're asking about is one that was written by Janneke Pieters and Anna Kunjujic, both from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands, as well as myself and Joel Gungui from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. So we investigated whether in developing countries, the burden of technological growth is unevenly spread across different groups of workers. And our focus was specifically on routine-biased technical change, which is this relatively recent trend that new technologies are used to automate routine tasks that were previously performed by human workers, but that are increasingly now performed by machines. Now, as Irina mentioned when she spoke, the effects of routine-biased technical change on the labor markets of high-income countries have been very well documented, right? We think we know that in the last decades, we've seen this process of job polarization, where employment growth has been concentrated in occupations with either low or high wages, while occupations in the middle of the wage distribution saw slower employment growth. And there's pretty persuasive evidence that this is at least partly due to the fact that jobs in the middle of the wage distribution in these countries tend to consist of a relatively high share of routine tasks and therefore routine bias technical change reduces the demand for workers in middle skilled jobs, right? So an example of that would be someone in a high skilled occupation could be a brain surgeon or a financial director. Their day-to-day job is something that's difficult to automate. If you think of someone, at least in a rich country, in a low-wage job, that may be a menial occupation that's done in person, like moving a piano up 3 flights of stairs. That's also not the easiest thing in the world to automate. But in the middle of the occupational distribution, you find people doing kind of office work or clerical work or bookkeeping, and those kind of repetitive routine tasks are easier to automate, and that's why we see this hollowing out of the skills distribution. So where our chapter comes in is the fact that the effects of routine bias technical change in developing countries have not been studied extensively. And we know that different jobs, because different jobs consist of different combinations of tasks, some workers are more exposed to the risk of automation than others. And in this chapter, we investigate whether women in developing countries are more at risk of automation because their jobs consist of more routine tasks. In terms of the data that we use, we look at the World Bank's Skills Towards Employment and Productivity, or STEP data. The STEP data is an initiative to measure specific work tasks in low and middle income countries, and included both household-based surveys and employer-based surveys to assess both the supply and the demand for occupational skills. These surveys have now been implemented in 18 countries so far, but we only analyzed the 13 countries for which household survey data was connected between 2012 and 2017, which include Armenia, Bolivia, Colombia, Georgia, Ghana, Kenya, North Macedonia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, Vietnam, and the Yunnan province of China. So there's some in Latin America, some in Asia, some in Africa. So what this data provides us with is individual level survey data in which both men and women describe the kind of tasks that they perform in their jobs. And then we take these descriptions and we construct a measure, again, much like I think like what Irina did. We construct a measure of the routine task intensity of their jobs. And the useful thing is this data is collected by the same agency, so it's harmonized across different countries, and it's representative of at least the urban labor markets in 13 low and middle income countries. And then we also did a second analysis, which is not included in the book chapter, but maybe I can refer to that just briefly, in which we studied the effects of routine bias technical change in South Africa, which is a middle income country that's characterized by notoriously high levels of inequality and unemployment and racial discrimination. And in this analysis, we use a series of cross-sectional labor force surveys, which allows us to observe trends play out in the labor market, trends in wages and employment, and how that varies across different occupations over time. So that's the methodology and the research questions, Ramiro.
Okay, thanks. I think that it's interesting that you are covering different regions in different contexts, so I think that you can also manage to think if there's no the global south, but different global south in each region, in terms of wages, skills, working conditions, and so on. So what did you find in your chapter?
So the first thing worth mentioning is that we find that in developing countries, it's the lowest paid occupations that are most routine intensive. And we think that's interesting, and we think it's important because it's not the same as what has been observed in developed countries. And many studies that have looked at technological growth in developing countries have assumed that the pattern of routine task intensity would be the same in developing countries as in the developed world, and we find very conclusively that that assumption is wrong. Secondly, we find that women's jobs tend to be more routine task intensive than men's. That's true in all of the different countries we look at all across all of these regions, bar the Philippines. So that's a very both of these results that I've mentioned are very robust across the different regions. And then we do a decomposition analysis, which shows that in most countries, this gender gap in routine task intensity is largely driven by women doing more routine intensive work than men within the same one-digit occupational group. And then we do a regression analysis which further shows that gender differences in occupational choice across two-digit occupations, as well as differences in human capital and ethnicity, account for just a small part of the gender gap in routine task intensity. So again, I think this is a very important result. It suggests that although some of why women are more vulnerable to the risk of automation is that they're more likely than men to work in specific occupations, the much more important factor here is that when you take a man and a woman with the same level of education in the same occupation, it tends to be the case that women do more routine intensive tasks, and that makes them more vulnerable to automation. In terms of the implication of these results, so I'd like to think that these findings contribute to our understanding of gender inequalities in developing country labor markets and how this relates to the potential impact of automation technologies. And although it's true, so other studies have found that developing country workers are less exposed to automation, which probably reflects the low relative price of labor in these countries and the concentration of employment in manual in-person tasks. But our results show that while there may not currently be a large incentive for employers to invest in automation of routine tasks, if we think that there'll be a continued decline in the cost of automation, I think a lot of people think that's exactly what's going to happen, then we would expect the impact of that technological advances to be concentrated among women and low-wage workers, right? And that's quite an ominous prediction. It means that unlike what we've seen in developed countries, where the inequality impact has been kind of ambiguous because some people, as a result of the hollowing out of the occupation distribution, move up, some people move down. In the countries that we studied, we think that the burden is going to fall mainly on people with at the bottom end of the wage distribution, on the more vulnerable groups. And it may be worth starting to think of appropriate policies to anticipate these trends. And it also means the fact that the people who are going to be affected are different from the groups that have been affected in developed countries suggests that maybe we need a different set of policies to respond to these changes. Ramiro, if I have time, maybe I can just briefly discuss what we found in South Africa, because I think that's also interesting. So there we looked at trends over time that we can observe. Now, interestingly, South Africa, it seems in terms of the overall effect is more like what we saw in developed economies. So we also see this hollowing out of the occupational distribution. But interestingly, if we look at the groups who are affected by that, in South Africa, we see that women are much more likely to move down the occupational distribution. When they lose these middle skilled jobs, they tend to move into lower skilled jobs, compared to men who tend to move up the occupational distribution. And vulnerable race groups kind of play out in a similar manner. The groups who are often discriminated against are negatively affected when they lose these middle skilled occupations. It seems they move down the occupational distribution, whereas more advantaged race groups move up the occupational distribution, which again is really worrying and something that I think we need to think about more carefully.
Hey, thanks, Roelof. I think that for hearing both of you talking about automation, I feel like if maybe we are not talking about automation itself in the sense of new technologies that are actually changing working conditions, but in a way we are seeing like a global division of tasks and labor, and maybe in the developing world, we have all these routine jobs or tasks still here with us. And maybe in the global north, they are just reskilling their population, moving to more flexible, more creative jobs. And maybe it will have an impact, not in terms of job losses, but in terms of conversions, of diversions, of GDP, productivity, wages across the globe, Maybe, I don't know, maybe instead of, I think that sometimes we need to redefine also the words that we are using, Maybe automation seems like it's already there, it's happening. And you are saying, look, what's happening is that all these people and maybe the poorest women, all these groups are working in applying all this routine knowledge, we can say. And so it will have an impact, maybe with new technologies coming, maybe without technologies here, but in different countries that are competing with us. So in a way, it will result in lower relative wages, in lower productivity, in lower growth. So maybe the discussion is, maybe I'm just asking in a way, maybe it's more a discussion about the global division of labor and of productivity as well. So I just leave it here. Maybe we can return to that later. I will move to the second part of the book. So there we study the penetration of labor platforms and its impact in the labor market. The second part of the book has 3 chapters, but now we're going to present 2 of them. And we have one of the authors of one of the chapters that couldn't join because of some power problems in South Africa, in some parts of South Africa. So in a way, it's also a lesson for us talking about AI and the 4th industrial revolution. And in many countries, we didn't solve the 3rd industrial revolution or even the 2nd industrial revolution about having electricity in our homes, in our workplaces, right? So, the book has 3 chapters, but we are going to talk about 2 of these 3 chapters now. You can check the other chapter, and I'm going to refer to this chapter as well, maybe just to give you an idea of this chapter. I will start with Diego Aguilar. Diego, along with Joaquin Gonzalez, Aileen Agüero, and Roxana Barrantes, wrote the 3rd chapter, Future of Work in the Global South, Digital Labor, New Opportunities and Challenges. And they did a very challenging exercise of conduct surveys to online workers in different regions of the globe. They work with Latin America, Diego and his team from the Institute of Peruvian Studies for Latin America, but then Learn Asia for Asia and RIA for Africa. So they go into the characteristics of online workers all over the global South. So Diego, thanks for being here. And again, the first part of our conversation is about your research questions and your methodology. Diego?
Thanks, Ramiro. Congratulations to everyone who participated on the developing and the publication of the book. Regarding your question, everybody here and most of us experience that in the current time of digitization, massive use of technologies, labor relations and the labor market in general have been affected by the inclusion of ICTs in not only qualified jobs, but also in those less qualified. Then in this changing nature of market labor with a key role of technologies, we are wondering if gender labor inequalities are also changing and how. So what we try to analyze in particular are jobs through digital platforms. Most of us know as mobile apps such as taxi services and delivery services, mostly known and highlighted by the evidence and literature as microwork or gig economy, especially in developed countries. As you mentioned in the introduction, we are working not only in Latin America, including countries such as Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Guatemala, but also in 7 countries in Africa and 6 countries in Asia. So the way we try to analyze is and to highlight is differences in people who participate in this kind of new labor or segment of market labor, not only within region, but also across countries, how this relative new labor market can represent an opportunity to traditionally exclude people of the labor market, such as rural people, women, and other ones, and opportunities such as increased participation in the labor market, extra income, or more time flexibility, But also this new segment of labor market could represent or could reinforce existing social disparities, not only considering labor market inequalities, but also digital ones. Then in this context, we are interested particularly in how women labor market participation and other outcomes, such income, gains, or premium, are affected by these kind of new works through digital platforms. Regarding our methodology, our approach was based in mixed methods. On the one hand, we use quantitative methods, econometrics and the other statistics tools to analyze the main determinants of having a digital platform work or participate in these new labor markets, and how gender-related outcomes are affected, mainly income. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, it also we face challenging in the way we collect people to participate in our qualitative work, part of the work, because we work with interviews during the pandemic, so we have to be very creative in the way we engage people to participate in interviews. We made interviews by Zoom, so we cover very personal topics related to discrimination, labor market, relationships through this digital platform work. So we have to be very, very conscious of the situation, even during the pandemic. Okay, this is what we have to say related to the
and what did you find? Because you did this study of these different regions that, of course, they have different history, different regulations, different set of skills in the labor market. So what did you find in this comparative picture of telework, we can say, in the Global South?
Yes, on the one hand, regarding to quantitative effects, in the 19 countries we analyzed, the decision of participation or having a digital platform works is related mainly to digital skills. So this showed that digital exclusion and inequality issues are not limited to the connected and unconnected, but also expressing among those who are already online. Second, our results shows that digital work and formal labor are not complementary activities, but rather substitutes one. We found that the probability of individuals who are unpaid house workers, employed and independent with employees working on these digital platforms is higher than those who are occupied. And this is particularly the situation of women. So for women, this kind of work represents an opportunity to get an extra income, and mainly the main occupation for them. But for men are the opposite one. No? This is a substitute one, a complementary opportunity to get an extra income. This suggests for us that digital work is more likely to be the first incursion into the labor market for women especially, and such a way to obtain more experience. Related to the income pay gap we analyzed, the gender pay gap we analyzed, we found that for women who do participate in this labor market, represents an average increase of 74 USD monthly income, and for women who don't participate through this digital platform, who have a potential average increase in their income of 127 USD per month. But interesting, if we compare the effect of men, we found that men potential gains is 14% higher than women gains. So even if we find positive effects for women, doing this kind of work through digital platforms, we found that the effect for men is higher.
Okay, so we have a picture there of a we can say complex phenomena of the platform economy, with all these differences in terms of gender, in terms of wages and income. But I get the feeling that we need comparable data across countries on the platform and labor markets, but we also need to get more granularity on the specific dynamics of maybe each country, each region regarding the penetration of these platforms, so it's kind of, I mean, we can focus on wage gains as find some measure, but maybe a job is a lot more than that. For example, I was hearing you thinking about gender, right? And you say, okay, for women, maybe they can experience a higher earnings or income by joining the platform economy, but they will engage in flexible jobs, gigs, for example, that in a way they can perpetuate some stereotype about women and the labor market, So maybe if you go a little beyond just economic gains, maybe you will find some other factors to take into account. So I will move to Urvashi. Urvashi Aneja wrote a chapter on online work and women in India, the opportunities and limits of digital entrepreneurship. And so Urvashi, you did a more ethnographic study of how women perceive themselves in the platform economy, which are maybe their abilities to manage their own business and so on. So maybe you can give us more granularity on these discussions. So again, the first question is, as with the other authors, about your research question and your methodology, and then we are going to move into findings and policy implications. Urvashi?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ramiro. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a big congratulations to the FoWiGS team for pulling together this fantastic book, and to all the other authors of the book as well. I always feel like a bit of an imposter in some of the future of work conversations because I'm not an economist, but maybe the world of work is changing so fast and so rapidly that we do need to kind of look at it in a more multifaceted kind of way to be able to appreciate the kind of changes that we're seeing. So our study looked at the motivations and the experiences and the well-being and the financial well-being of women on online work platforms in India. And we looked specifically at women on microwork platforms and women on freelancer platforms. So the microwork platforms being your much more kind of specific, when tasks are broken down into very specific components like data annotation or labeling, and the freelancer platforms being things like, a wide range of things, everything from like kind of graphic design to being a secretarial work to being a programmer. There's a wide range of activities. And the reason that we looked at this was that, in the Indian context, we see that women's participation in the workforce is declining. And it's actually one of the lowest rates of labor force participation in South Asia. And this is despite high rates of economic growth over the past decade. And it's also despite increasing enrollment of women in education. So it is a bit of a puzzle in the Indian context that why is it that we have increasing rates of women in education, a drop in rates of women dropping out, but also decreasing rates of women's participation in the labor force. And so in that context, online platforms have really been kind of spoken of by government, by development agencies as an important way, or as one of the ways in which to increase women's participation in the labor force, because it allows them to work from home, to work remotely, to do flexible work, so on and so forth. And so as a kind of entrepreneurial activity. And there's a very, very strong narrative in the Indian context about platforms enabling kind of micro-entrepreneurship, and this being a way to create or to address slow job growth, and particularly for the youth who are much more digitally savvy. So that's what we wanted to understand, that, what does this Is it a form of micro-entrepreneurialism? What does that even mean? And is this form of micro-entrepreneurialism enabling their economic empowerment and their sense of well-being? And what we find currently is that there's mostly anecdotal evidence, as Ramiro and many of you mentioned already, on the impact of or how platform economies are changing the world of work, and particularly with regard to online work. So location-based platform work has become much more, or is much more visible. And in recent years, some of the difficulties faced by workers have also come to the surface. So there's been protests by Uber drivers, the Indian equivalent, Ola, etc. But online work is much more invisible because it's done at home. It's typically done for overseas clients. You're doing it across many jurisdictions, across very different labor market conditions. So it's hard to kind of get a grip on what is happening in the online workspace. So we did a mixed method study. We did a survey of about 350 women across across metropolitan cities and smaller towns in India, and across 3 of the largest online work platforms. And then based on that, we identified a smaller subsection of women who we did deeper semi-structured interviews with, as well as focus group discussions. Similar to what Diego was saying, we also faced challenges with regard to access because of the pandemic. So we did have to innovate in the kind of methods that we were using. And it was a little bit of trial and error along the way. And, I think there was a lot of learnings for us, even in terms of methodologically. And also, it showed us that we can actually hone some of these methods even more to be able to reach populations that otherwise we may not have been able to reach. So we use things like WhatsApp diaries as a way to get women to communicate with us on what their experience was. We created these kind of vignettes, and we use those for focus group discussions. And in some sense, I think, especially for women who were working at home, who did who were constrained in terms of how much time they could go and make to go and meet researchers, so on and so forth. It was actually quite interesting to be able to give them this online space to be able to have these conversations. So that was a little bit about the research questions and the method that we used.
Okay, and what about the findings and the policy implications?
So we kind of broke down our set of questions into a couple of buckets. The first bucket that we looked into is what are the skills that women had who were on online work platforms. And what we found was that most had undergraduate degrees, and many even had postgraduate degrees, many even in STEM subjects. And there was also no major difference in the qualifications, the education qualifications for women on micro work platforms and on freelancer platforms. And I think that's relevant for two reasons, right? I think one reason is that it tells us that even though micro work and freelance can require very different skill sets, right? Like freelance can require a much higher set of skills if you're going to be a graphic designer, if you're going to be a programmer, as opposed to data annotation. That didn't seem to make a difference, right? So you had very high skilled women doing micro work as well, and they were all high skilled women. They all had undergraduate degrees at least, right? The other reason I think the skilling question was relevant is because there is a kind of narrative that at least we see in the Indian context that online work is going to create opportunities for people from low wage backgrounds, from low skill backgrounds to be able to enter the world of work, right? But what we see here was that it's women who already have very high qualifications who are participating in online work. And it's not, and in some of the other work that we've done, we've also found that, competition is very intense on online work platforms. So it does raise this question of whether online work platforms are actually going to be able to create employment opportunities for low skilled workers or low wage workers who wouldn't want otherwise part of the labor market. The second thing that we looked at is what women did earlier, right? So did they have jobs earlier? What were those jobs? And again, we found that nearly half of them had jobs before, full-time jobs in a wide range of professions. They were teachers, they were bank tellers, they were in the IT sector, they were working for PR agencies. And again, I think why this is relevant is because it suggests that online work was not enabling a new segment of people to enter the workforce, right? It was people who were already in the workforce, and many of them were actually in formal sector jobs and even had access to kind of formal social protection within those formal sector jobs, but had shifted over to online work platforms. And I think the women point, I think here adds some nuance, right? Because when we look at the kind of the narrative on platform economies in industrialized countries, we see that there is a shift from formal to informal. When we look at it in the global south in general terms, we see it's not a shift from informal to informal because it's people who are already in the informal sector. But in the case of women, we saw that it is a shift from formal to informal, right? And I think, so again, I think that's relevant in terms of adding some more nuance to these narratives. And then we looked at what their motivations were for joining these platforms. And I think this is, again, very important because their reasons for joining these platforms was not because they wanted better work or they weren't getting work. They were getting married and they had family responsibilities and they had children. And so they'd all worked previously. And once they got married, they felt they could not, or there was family pressure, one of the two, and they felt they couldn't continue with work while they were also, fulfilling their care responsibilities. And so for a lot of them, it was kind of part-time work. It was something they did on the side. It was something that they said that, hey, this is a good example for my children. It keeps me busy during the day. It allows me to kind of stave off maybe errands that I might have to do, saying like, hey, I'm doing something productive, I'm working. So it's very much just kind of socio-cultural reason for working and not so much driven by the job itself or particular kind of monetary gains that they got. We also looked at questions around earnings, and we found that for many of them, they made around, like, the income range, it differed widely depending on whether they were on microwork platforms or freelancer. On freelancer platforms, they made more than on microwork platforms. But for pretty much all of them, it was not a primary source of income. So they were not the bread earners of their family. The income that they got from these platforms was primarily for either their own personal expenses or to meet their children's expenses. And not to meet their children's expenses in terms of education or those big expenses, but more things that they'd want to treat them to, or things they would want to do for them as a way, as being to spoil them, perhaps even. We also spoke to them about their experience of work. And across the board, they all said that the amount of work was decreasing. There could have been here a kind of method issue because this was in the context of COVID and in the early kind of phases of COVID. So there was a lot of flux, I think, in terms of the kind of work that was available. I think many more people were also signing on to these platforms. And so there was a shifting kind of demand and supply. So I don't know how reliable that is in terms of work is decreasing. But many of them said it was hard to find their first gig. Re-intermediation was pretty common. So, if you were successful on a platform, you would hire 2-3 other friends of yours and kind of like your girlfriends and share the work amongst them rather than doing it yourself. Many said they learned new skills, but they also felt that there were limited opportunities for career progression. So they didn't feel that those skills were fungible to offline jobs, and they didn't feel that there was a sense of career progression within those online jobs. And I think what was really stark and quite awful to really hear was that a number of them also mentioned online harassment, right? Some of them said that they'd been asked to record pornographic material, or once they had been given a job, then they were there was kind of sexual insults, etc., and that made them want to get off the platform, obviously, right? So that really kind of stood out for us when we were doing our research. So just to wrap up, and I know I have like less than 10 seconds left, so really quickly, I think at an individual level for the women that we spoke to, we saw positive stories. They spoke about increased empowerment. They spoke about self-sufficiency. Many seemed happy to set an example for their children. Many were happy to have something to do and to keep themselves busy and productive. But I think the question that arises for us is that at a structural level, what does this mean, right? Does this mean I don't think it provides a convincing convincing argument that at a structural level, online platforms are able to create meaningful opportunities for women that allow them to address kind of gender discrimination, and perhaps even online platforms lock in some of those gender-based roles. And it was really interesting that one of the women said to us that she felt that she would have a greater chance of kind of addressing gender-based discrimination in a more traditional job, where there were more well-recognized signposts of progress and success and kind of going up a career ladder. So I think this disconnect between the individual and structural is important to keep in mind, and should be a reminder that we don't want to settle for this status quo, that yes, it is improving things for some people, but certainly it shouldn't be the status quo. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Ramiro.
Okay, thanks, Urvashi. The final chapter of that the authors are not here because of this failure to finish the second industrial revolution in Africa. They were not only doing research, but in a way acting as stakeholders, as part of, as drivers of change, we can say, because they were involving in measuring well-being and working conditions in platforms, performing these ratings of each platform across different countries, with the idea that reputational capital is important now for platforms, so they can engage them in improving working conditions or the conditions of users, we can say, and with that, trying to come up with better working conditions. But they also engage in a very interesting conversation and discussion about working conditions in outside the platform economy, in the global north and the global south, because this project called FoWiGS, FoWiGS Foundation and project, they started in Europe because in many countries in Europe, platforms were the main way to lose benefits for workers, moving from formal jobs to this kind of hybrid, formal, informal, platform-mediated jobs. So they were worried about losing working rights, and so they were starting this project of creating these ratings for platforms. Then they moved to the global south, and of course the ratings were much lower than in Germany, if you take Ecuador or Chile, than in Germany. But they also realized that maybe the previous jobs of people who are in the platform, maybe they were informal jobs. So maybe they are better off now with the platform than without the platform, and that was not the case in Germany. So in a way, they had to engage in framing their own agenda, their own narratives, when they apply the same methodology to such a different labor market as the global south labor markets. So you will find a very interesting discussion about that in this chapter called Fair Work in the Platform Economy, a Global South Perspective. I invite you just to read. I don't want to spoil or to change the messages of this chapter, so I will stop here with my summary of this chapter. But I think that a very, very stimulating conversation there about different labor markets and how can we address the issue of the platform economy. So let me finish this interesting conversation with you with two questions, one for the team on automation and the second one for the team on the platform economy. And it has to do with more the narratives or global discussions on technology and labor markets. For you, for the team on automation, we are all discussing the hollowing out hypothesis, this idea of the missing middle in the labor market distribution or wage distribution. and this idea of that technology is creating more wage inequality because of this polarization of wages. And hearing you now, I think that maybe we need to reframe, in a way, the debate when we come to the Global South. So my question is for you, if you want to answer or say something about this, how can we reframe the debate on automation and hollowing out just to fit our own challenges and opportunities in the Global South? If you want to take these, just thoughts, and ideas, go ahead. Irene and Roelof.
Irene, you want to go first?
Sure, yes. In Latin America and in all the developing world, we do have a group of people, very large group of people, which would be the very unskilled. And this group of people is very different from the unskilled in the north, because in a way they are mostly in informal jobs. Some of them are sort of in a subsistence economy that can take different forms depending on which country or continent we are talking about. But in Argentina, for example, collecting cardboard and recycling material would be a type of job for a lot of people. And that is not even a paid job. It's like a self-employment in a way. So a lot of what we are doing and in our data and in our statistics, we do have a large group of people who are missing from there. When we talk about employment, we are excluding a large group of people. So when we refer to whether we have problems in the middle of the skill distribution or in the bottom of the skill distribution, we need to be more precise about what we mean. Are we excluding people who are excluded from the formal economy, who are excluded from having unemployment altogether? So that's a huge difference between looking at the future of jobs in Latin America, in Africa, in some countries in Asia, and looking at these same issues in the developed world. There are large groups of people in developing countries that do not have a match, or at least do not have a match in the same order of magnitude in the developed world.
Roelof, you want to react?
Yeah, so I mean, regarding this narrative, I think the economic narrative regarding technology has generally been more optimistic than in other disciplines, right? Economists tend to focus the benefits of technology. I think that's certainly true, and I think part of what both of our chapters, our chapter in Irene's chapter, argues is that some of the evidence that supports that narrative in developed countries may not necessarily apply in developing countries quite as strongly. But at the same time, I do think it's true that these technological benefits or this technological advances will have benefits for consumers and prices and those sorts of things, right? And I think that the question is just how exactly, from a public policy perspective, we know that these changes are coming. Right. So where I'm in South Africa, we know we're starting to see the effects. We're probably a little bit behind in some other countries, but we see that companies are adopting these technologies and are looking for new ways to adopt these technologies. So I think the question really is, how do you respond to that? You've got a little bit of we can see into the future a couple of years, and how do you respond to that? And what are the implications for training and education and social grants? And I think that's an important part of the narrative.
Okay, now for you we have just 5 minutes, so sorry, but for Urvashi and Diego, there are also narratives on the platform economy. One for the global north, saying that in a way they are reducing the formal labor markets, and workers are losing some benefits along the way. And then in the global south, we have this idea of platforms as a silver bullet for for those who are less behind. You know, that you can start without being part of the formal sector, without having the skills. You can just escalate within the platform a gig and then something like that. So again, I have a question for you, just or an idea about how can we reframe these narratives, taking into account your own research? Maybe is that so that we have these opportunities, or that we have these challenges as in the global north? So just 1 minute idea for you, from you, sorry.
Can I go first, please? Okay. I think that on the one hand, as you mentioned, there are such as opportunities for those who are excluded that represent an opportunity to get an extra income, to get labor experience, to then go to the formal labor market. But this kind of informalities present in this market, especially such as the lack of protection standards, social security obligations, and the lack of responsibility of these digital platforms are very, very conscious of the way we're going on. And I know that most of the countries are now including in their regulatory framework and legislations this new obligation for these digital platforms to include social security systems, health securing for their workers, but and the way this is the kind of reinforcing the inequalities we found in the digital labor market. No? So these people have to go step by step before the entry to the formal labor market. No? And this is unfair compared to the other ones.
Yeah. Urvashi?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's so binary, right? Like the narrative on either opportunities in the global south and this shift from formal to informal in the global north. I also don't think that what we're seeing is the kind of step-by-step movement to formality. Like it seems like platforms have just become part of our urban infrastructure and they're here to stay. And it doesn't seem like it's going to be a stepping stone to more formal sector jobs, because those formal sector jobs are very few and they're shrinking for many of the reasons that you all already talked about. So I think what we're seeing is some kind of recasting of informality. I think what we're also seeing is some kind of like algorithmically mediated informality, and that is shifting power, and that is creating a different set of challenges and a different set of opportunities. But I think that, two things that are really important is we do have to start thinking about the data rights of workers in a platform economy, because I think that's really, really key. And if we are to kind of see it through in terms of, what opportunities, then we have to find a way that workers are able to leverage that data to be able to then access different kinds of services, whether it's access to finance or so on and so forth. So I think we have to kind of take it further. Like where we are right now is not, and in India, we're already seeing a huge backlash now against many of the urban platforms by workers.
Okay, thanks for that. Huge congrats, and thanks mainly for all the authors here of the chapters of the book. I think that eliminating the blind spots in terms of data and knowledge, of course, goes beyond this team, but I think that we just put some ideas, some data, some knowledge that can start the discussion. So again, thanks everyone. The book is online in our website, FoWiGS.net, so you can download there, and see you soon. Bye.